Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Adult Forum. Welcome to 2023. We haven't met for 3 weeks now and glad to be back. Today, joining us again is Jennifer Wright Knust, who is a scholar of religion specializing in early Christian history and the religions of the ancient Mediterranean. Her numerous articles, book chapters, and edited books address the materiality of texts, the intersection of Christian practices with other ancient religions, and the ethics of interpretation in ancient as well as contemporary texts. Today's presentation is how do you recognize an ancient Christian? You see one, and I made her promise that the answer was not just look at the podium and then you'll see an ancient Christian. I was cutting her off if that was where she was going. But Jenny Knust joined us again. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you so much, everyone. And thanks for inviting me to come be part of this group again. It was really fun. It's good to see you again. So this question was a question that Nelson wanted to address. So I'm like, okay, I love that question, actually. And I normally, if I'm teaching in the New Testament, would answer this question very slowly. I would take a semester to sort of build up an answer, and we debate it. And it certainly, we can debate it here, and I hope we will in the context of this class as well. But I'm just going to give you my answer, and an answer that is a common answer among scholars right now. And we can think about the implications of that answer together as the conversation progresses. So the answer I'm giving you is, you can't. This is an answer that most scholars working today might give, scholars working in religious studies contexts like I do. This is pretty much the position that most scholars are taking right now, and I'm going to show you why, and then we can talk about what we think about the answer. So the two reasons I want to defend for why you can't today, and again, I would normally in a New Testament class would take a good month or so to build us up to the considering this question. So I'm giving you the sort of quick and dirty scholarly answer. In the first Christian century, Christians either saw themselves as Jews or non-Jews who followed the God of Israel. It's important to remember that the word Christian does not exist, right? There's no word Christian. The word Christian is invented perhaps, according to Acts, it's invented, some 15 years after Jesus dies. But even then, there's some debate among scholars about whether how that story is or isn't connected to what was happening at the time that the author's writing about, because Acts is written significantly after those events. The word Christian appears in a non-Christian source first around 110 CE or AD, yeah? So in other words, there's no word Christian, so what are you declaring yourself to be? Well, you're not declaring yourself to be a Christian because there's no such thing, yeah? And in fact, the word Christian, some scholars are arguing, it was a particularly nice argument on this angle by a scholar by the name of Maya Katrositz, are suggesting that the name Christian was actually invented by outsiders in the 2nd century who were making fun or wanted to disparage Christ followers. Yeah. So in other words, the name, so similar to like in our context, the word queer began as a way of disparaging LGBTQ folks, and then it was claimed by the LGBT community as a name, yeah? So that kind of thing happens where one community is disparaged and then they claim the name as a sort of way of resisting their disparagement, if that makes sense. So now that's hypothetical, that's a speculative possibility, but that is a possibility that that's how the word Christian gets invented. So what then made Jesus' followers distinctive and recognizably different, if anything? Most of my students usually say, well, they must have been different in some way. I mean, obviously, eventually, circa 110 or so, they start to be persecuted, at least a few of them, for claiming the name Christian. What's going on? But still, from an outsider perspective, not much, right? From an outsider perspective, they may have understood themselves, Christ followers may have understood themselves to be incredibly different, but that doesn't mean outsiders saw them as different. So in my tradition, I'm American Baptist. I grew up in New England, and the American Baptists in my little town, like we think of ourselves as like super different, right? There's a joke in my town that the main food bank is at my little church in Mount Vernon. And it's a little tiny church, 30 people at my church. And there's, even though it's only 1,500 people in the town, it's the main food bank for that region. And so there's really not enough support for the food bank. And so the church was like, what are we going to do? And praying, this happened a while ago, like 25 years ago. What are we going to do? We need more help for the food bank. And the Episcopal Church in Reedville stepped up. And Lois Williams, a dear lady at my church, was like, well, we needed help. We knew God would provide, but we didn't expect him to send Episcopalians. Like people see themselves as really different, but that doesn't mean that others do. Nobody in my town knows if you're a Baptist or an Episcopalian who goes to the church in Reedville. You can't tell. So from an outsider perspective, there's probably not a lot of difference between Jesus' followers and others, especially prior to the destruction of the temple, which happened in 70 CE. Okay, here we go. The evidence. Piece of evidence that scholars are talking about now is that probably the Jesus followers really did worship at the temple. I wasn't trained to think that when I was growing up in church, but if you read the Gospels carefully, Jesus and the disciples are at the temple all the time, and they're not having a problem with it. Yes, Jesus critiques the temple and the so-called cleansing of the temple scene, but why do you get mad at a temple? Because you love it. If you don't get mad at something you don't care about. Yeah. So here, for example, in Luke chapter 25, this is the ascension scene in the Gospel of Luke. Does someone want to read that? Can you read that? Is it too far away? Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay. Then he led them out as far as Bethany, and lifting up his hands, he blessed them. While he was blessing them, he withdrew from them and was carried into heaven. And they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and they were continually in the temple blessing God.
So according to the Gospel of Luke, where are the Jesus followers after Jesus ascends into heaven? At the temple, worshiping God at the Jerusalem temple, right? And they're in Jerusalem. And as we'll see later, Paul seems to confirm that they're in Jerusalem. Now, Luke was written, which scholar you are, but, right now anyone's debating anywhere between 90 and 110 at this point with Luke. All right. So there's a lot of other evidence of Jesus in the temple, or Jesus respecting the temple. So one example that my students always find mind-blowing is this one from Mark, right at the very, very beginning of the Gospel of Mark. Do I have another reading volunteer? I'm so happy I have undergrads here. Y'all are just going to read, and, it's great. You have good eyes. It's wonderful. Some people have to carry glasses around wherever they go. Can anyone read the Mark one? We won't have to read them all, but yeah, go ahead.
Mark 1:43-44. Immediately the skin disease left him, and he was made clean. After sternly warning him, Jesus sent him away at once, saying to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them."
So Jesus heals a leper, or a man who's stricken with leprosy. And what happens? And then what is he supposed to do? Not tell anyone. I love that. Messianic secret. That's another class. Okay. But what's the next thing he's supposed to do?
Show yourself to the priest.
Exactly. And make a sacrifice. Right? Mm-hmm. So is this a critique of the temple? The answer would be no. If one can read this as actually Jesus affirming temple cult and sacrificial cult in Israel. Yeah. Another example that, if you think about it from a different angle, my own American Baptist upbringing for a second, and read this. The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it, but do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. Okay, so we know that in Matthew especially, Jesus and the scribes and Pharisees, not so much. Yeah. Nevertheless, where do the scribes and Pharisees sit? On Moses' seat. And if you're at Matthew, who do you love? Moses. Yeah. So in other words, we're going to go through a whole Matthew 23 calling them hypocrites. Nevertheless, who interprets the law really well? The scribes and the Pharisees. And what do the scribes and the Pharisees want? Observant Jewish law, right? Right? Okay. And then in Luke, we have the story of Jesus being taken to the temple as an infant. Yeah. And in order to be for his family or his parents to offer sacrifice. And there's a quotation, every firstborn male shall be designated as holy to the Lord, and they offered sacrifice according to what is stated in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves for 2 and 2 young pigeons. Again, this is written somewhere between 90 and 110, so I'm not worried about the historicity, whether that happened or not, but from the perspective of the writer, what do you do if you have baby Jesus? You go to the temple and you make the right sacrifice, and you observe the law. Now in John is quite distinctive here. Jesus visits the temple a number of times and participates in the festal observances in the temple, right? So there's the observance of the Passover, the celebration of the Feast of Booths, which is the harvest festival, the Feast of Dedication, which is a version of what now is Hanukkah, and then again to observe Passover, which of course is when the events leading towards the Passion take place, right? So in other words, and from John's perspective, Jesus is visiting the temple in order to observe the festal customs on a regular basis, and from the acting like a normal Jew who had access to the temple, who lived close enough to go there, would go. All right. What about Paul in the temple? So Paul, of course, is probably killed sometime around 60-ish. So before the temple is destroyed in 70. His letters are a lot earlier than the Gospels in terms of when they're actually written. So in a way, he's better evidence for what's going on with the Jesus followers prior to the destruction of the temple than the Gospel writers themselves. And let's ask for another volunteer since we have our beautiful readers here. Would someone like to read Galatians 2:1 and 9 to 10?
Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. And when James and Cephas and John, Cephas being, we think, Peter, who were acknowledged pillars, recognized the grace that had been given to me, they gave to Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. They asked only one thing, that we remember the poor, which was actually what I was eager to do.
Okay, so James, and as he rightly points out, probably Peter and John, where are they? At the temple in Jerusalem, right? They're in Jerusalem, presumably because they're participating in the temple. At this time, if you want to get your word out, your news out to your fellow Jews, where are you going to be? Jerusalem, that's where you're going to be, so that you can try to convince people that Jesus is the Messiah. And that's where they are. And what are they doing? Well, they're engaged in the mission. From Paul's perspective, I don't know, they don't have a voice here, but their job is to convert or to convince the circumcised, namely ethnic Jews, that Jesus is the Messiah. And what's Paul's job? It's again Paul's version of the story, whatever they think. Paul's job is to convince the Gentiles. That's the job, right? Okay, so again, fits the evidence that we have. The very end of Romans, Paul offers a number of greetings, and then he offers the following doxology. Now to the one who is able to strengthen you according to my gospel and the proclamation of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery that was kept secret for long ages, but is now disclosed through the prophetic writings, is made known to all the Gentiles, according to the command of the eternal God, to bring about the obedience of faith to the only wise God, through Jesus Christ, to whom be glory forever. Amen. I included this because I wanted us to notice that the gospel and the proclamation of Jesus Christ was kept secret, but is now disclosed through the prophetic writings to be made known to the Gentiles. So there's some reason about something in Paul's theology that makes Jesus Christ the key to unlocking a secret that's in the prophets in order to make some kind of message known to the Gentiles. Now, Gentiles is the Jewish word for everybody else. That's all it means, everybody else. And it's only a Jewish word. Yeah. Like if I were Greek or I might call myself an Aphrodisian if I'm Aphrodisias, or an Ephesian if I'm from Ephesus, or an Alexandrian if I'm from Alexandria, or a Roman if I'm from Rome. That's how I would refer to myself. I would never call myself a Gentile. I wouldn't even know what anybody was talking about. What's that? What's a Gentile? The only reason I would know what a Gentile is if I was friends with a Jew and they were like, oh, you're a Gentile. Just like now I know that I'm a goy. Yeah? You know what that is? Yeah? Right. Okay. So the evidence so far is that Jesus' followers were worshiping in Jerusalem at the temple, and Jesus doesn't seem to have critiqued the temple as an institution other than, what's going on in the temple in his historical lifetime he was critical about, but he wasn't critical of the idea of the temple being there, right? He also wasn't critical of the idea of sacrifice necessarily. And that's more debatable, but he at least sends that one leper or the person afflicted with leprosy to offer a sacrifice. We know that. And from the perspective of the Gospel of Luke, his parents were actively engaged in sacrifice in the temple, right? Okay. And we know that Paul thinks that something happened with Jesus that made the Gentiles come in. So how do you make Gentiles come in then if you're all about the God of Israel? That's the problem. Okay. Well, one thing that we need to know is that Gentiles visited the temple often. The temple was one of the wonders of the world. Everybody knew about it. Yeah. So everybody knows about, the White House. And if you're a tourist, you want to go see the White House, or you want to go see the Capitol building, or, everybody knows about the Hollywood sign, etc. Everybody knew about the temple. And when people would go visit who were not Jewish. And not only would they go visit, they would have sacrifices offered, or they would make offerings, have priests make offerings on their behalf. A famous person who did that was the Emperor Augustus. Yeah. So the priests offered regular sacrifices on behalf of the Roman emperors until the Roman revolt against the Romans in 66 to 73. And in fact, it was the priests refusing to offer sacrifice in the temple on behalf of the emperors that appears to have been the thing that provoked the actual blow up of that revolt. Yeah. Okay. So here's an example, just a little, I want to prove to you that I'm right. by showing you this inscription. Sorry, the picture's so blurry. This is from the Israel State Museum in Jerusalem. Go to their website. You can see a lot of really cool stuff. Most of my pictures are coming from that. So if you want some more evidence, we'll check that out. Here is an inscription, one of the few inscriptions that was found that says, you want to read it? Go ahead, yeah.
No foreigner shall enter within the forecourt and the balustrade around the sanctuary. Whoever is caught will have himself to blame for his subsequent death.
Ooh, okay, let's think about that for a second. So, okay, this is under Herod the Great. This was up during the time of Herod the Great, who we know about because that was when baby Jesus was born. Yes, because one for Christmas. You remember Herod? Okay, so this sign and probably others like it were around protecting from the entryway between the court of the Gentiles and the court of Israel. So the way the temple was organized is there was on a big temple platform. Remember that picture from the beginning? The Gentiles were welcome there, and then there was another forecourt that only people from Israel were welcome, and then there was another one where only Israelite men were welcome, and then there was another one where only priests were allowed, and then at the middle was the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest was allowed once a year on Yom Kippur at the end. Yeah, that's the way the temple was structured. So what this sign is telling you, if you're a Gentile, is don't you go any further than here. Welcome, buy your little animal, buy your bird, give it to somebody. The priest will offer it on your behalf, but this is as far as you can go. So what does that suggest?
There were Gentiles there, they just weren't allowed everywhere.
Exactly.
Now, when they say foreign, is that synonymous with Gentile?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I can't read the Greek, it's too blurry, but it must be Gentile. Yeah.
If a Jew from Rome would be welcome in the temple.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the reasons to have this sign, how are you going to know?
Right.
Because they're not going to, if you're a Jewish man, the only way to know is if you could check to see if they were circumcised or not, right? But are you going to really pull up or pull down? Well, they didn't have pants, but are you going to pull up? Are you going to go like this? Pull your kids on and so how would you know? You wouldn't know. So you put a strong warning like this up to, and remind people that they have to be responsible, right? For their behavior, because part of the whole reason, that's part of making the place sacred, right? even in my little tiny church in Mount Vernon, Maine, I don't clomp up to the altar unless I'm preaching that day. You know what I mean? So there's spaces that have different kinds of designation, and that's one of the ways that you know that the place is sacred, because the space is organized in a particular way, and not everyone can go everywhere. Even our own classroom is kind of silly, but you're not standing up here. maybe you should be. Rooms tell us how to behave. Yeah. So exactly. So this is evidence that Gentiles visited the temple often, and in fact, probably wanted to get into the inner sanctuaries too, and that was dating. So this is a little bit of a later evidence. So in a way, it's a little bit specious for me to bring it up because this is post destruction of the temple. I don't know exactly when, you can't really tell, but it's probably 2nd or 3rd century, maybe even later. It's not clear because it's graffiti. Okay, so it's really hard to tell when this is from. But I've taken students to Turkey many times, and we always go find this if you just go see it. If you want, if you're in Miletos, which is a city in Asia Minor near to where Paul was active. And there's this see how there's seats like this? These are called topos inscriptions or place inscriptions. And it says, the place of the Jews and the God-fearers. So it's like saving my seat, right? Like it's like having box seats. I'm sorry, I lived in Boston a long time, so what comes to me is Fenway Park. But maybe I should think of something else. Like, I don't know.
Fenway Park's good. Okay,
Fenway Park is okay, good. So it's like having, this is like the seat where, Big Poppy gets to sit whenever he comes. But this is saying the place of the Jews and the God-fearers. In other words, the Jews and some other group of people that are called God-fearers, whatever that means, sit next to them on this one seat, which is kind of like over here. It's not a great seat, but it's not terrible. It also says, of course, that Jews are going to the theater, by the way, and that they're being seen at the theater. They're active members of their civic community. I have a lot more evidence of that if you want me to prove it to you, that they actually, I don't know where I got this impression growing up that Jews in antiquity were like hiding in a corner. Like, no, they were going to the market, they were going to the theater, they were hanging out with others. If you go look in Asia Minor, their synagogues are in the middle of everybody else's place. They're not hiding. In fact, in Sardis, they have a huge fountain that everybody went to get their water from. So put that out of your mind if you were like me, given that bad information when you were 7 years old. That is wrong.
I guess there's some Christians that would say if they were going to the theater, were they also dancing?
Well, I don't know if we can tell from a typo inscription, Nelson, but I'm a historian when I'm in my career, and I'm as a historian. I'm not thinking anything is true unless you can prove it. We have to be skeptical. That's our job. All right. So this is quite a long inscription from another town, and again, it's a bit disingenuous of me because it's probably a 3rd century or 4th century inscription from a town called Aphrodisias, which is pretty close to Miletus. I've also been there when I take students there. It's not that far. We can go on a bus to Aphrodisias, and it's another town sort of in this area where Paul was active, although he doesn't send a letter there. We don't know if he ever visited. And this is an inscription that we don't know where it comes from. We've lost the context for it, but it clearly shows a mix of Jews and non-Jews who are called God-fearers. So I don't know. It says God or help, a building or gift for the dish. One speculation is this is a soup kitchen or something. People can come get food here. The below listed members of the Association of Lovers of Learning, who also wholly praise the Lord, I guess, erected for the relief of suffering in the community from their own resources, this memorial building. Now here the names are the key part. Jael, we know this name from the Hebrew Bible, right? Jael, the patron with his or her, it's his in Greek, which is weird, but maybe the Jael is a male name. Son Joshua, the official. Theodotius Palatinos, possibly a former employee of the imperial court, named after the Palatine Hill. That's, in editor's explanation. That is not in the inscription, right? But look at that name. Theodotus Palatinos is not a Jewish name. What about Jael? Totally a Jewish name, yeah? With his son Hilarianos, not a Jewish name. Samuel, leader of the association, Jewish name. Apostolite. Why is he a proselyte and his name is Samuel? Joseph, son of Jesse, Jewish name. Benjamin, the psalm singer, Jewish name. Judas, the good-natured, Jewish name. Joseph, a proselyte. There's another proselyte who's taken a Jewish name. Sabbatai, son of Amakath, blah, 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 blah. The point is that here we have inscription probably from the 3rd century, perhaps later, proving that Jews and non-Jews are mixing, and the fact that non-Jews are giving money to this synagogue's soup kitchen or relief project, whatever it is, and that some of these Gentile followers of the God of Israel are taking Jewish names, right? That's how far they're going, and fully becoming a member of the community in some way. Gentiles who are becoming members of Jewish communities. We certainly know that in Aphrodisias from the 3rd or 4th century, but we also know it from an earlier period, and we know that from literary evidence, which is never as good from my perspective as a historian as the material stuff, but that's okay. So we have literary evidence of non-Jews becoming Jews of some kind, and we have also evidence of Romans making fun of Jews for being Jews. Yeah. Being a Jew was a disparaged category, at least if you were a certain kind of Roman. But if you were other kind of Roman, you might well want to attach yourself to Jews in some way and be their friends and even potentially be a proselyte. And we know they did that. So there's this poet named Horace, perhaps you've heard of him, and there's a very bad joke in one of his satires about Jews. Where he promises not to insult some clipped Jew, that's Jewish perspective on circumcision, by violating their odd religious festivals. Then there's Tacitus, who's a 1st century Roman historian who describes the Roman general Pompey's entrance into the temple when the Romans in 63 BCE took or annexed Judea as part of the Roman Empire. Pompey went into the temple and took it upon himself to go check out what was going in the Holy of Holies. Now, from the Roman perspective, this was, a good orientalizing moment to gaze in what's going on. From a Jewish perspective, the Jewish historian Josephus describes these same events and describes the way that the populace of Judea at the time and Jerusalem at the time was totally devastated by the fact that Pompey did this, because no one is allowed in the Holy of Holies except for the high priest in the temple once a year. Then the 3rd example is from Suetonius. Now, we're not going to try to solve this, but I'm just going to let you know it exists in the world, okay? So Suetonius, who's a 2nd century Roman historian, suggests that the Roman Emperor Claudius, who was emperor from 41 to 54, expelled Jews from the city of Rome because they, quote, I want to say that, this is the big moment, made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus. $1 million question. Is that supposed to be Christ? Well, get a PhD and make your claim, because nobody can agree. Okay. But at the very least, what do we know that Suetonius thinks is being expelled? Jews, right? So is Suetonius, even if Christus is Christ, we're expelling Jews. 41 to 54. The evidence, part 3, Gentile Jesus followers view themselves as Jewish in some way. They did not convert to Christianity. And I'm going to prove this to you. And again, I would do this over the course of a semester if we were doing New Testament, so I'm really zooming through this stuff. Okay. So here's Galatians. I'll read that one because I put a bunch of Greek in there because I wanted to see the technical terms. But when I saw that this is from Galatians, when they saw they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas, as Christian points out, probably Peter, before them all, if you, though a Judaios or Jew or a Judean, someone from Judea, that's what Judaios means. In English translations, this is Jew, but it could just as easily mean someone from Judea. Though a Judaios, live like a Gentile. The Greek word here is ethnikos, which means nation, member of the nations, and not like a Judaios, someone from Judea or a Jew. How can you compel the Gentile to Judaizing? Okay. We are Judaioi, people from Judea, by birth, and we are not sinners descending from the Gentiles. ex ethna, out of the nations. All right, so forget the whole like what's the fight between Peter and Paul thing. Let's just think about what is going on in terms of ethnic markers and what this suggests about who Christians are, this little argument that they had. What Paul is saying is that Cephas or Peter is compelling the Gentile to Judaizing, to Judaize. You see that in your English translations. What does it mean to Judaize? Can you Judaize if you're already a Jew? No. No, if you're going to Judaize, you have to be a Gentile who in some way is acting like a Jew in a way that someone else thinks is offensive. Yeah. So Paul thinks that these folks, that Cephas is compelling the Gentiles to act like Jews in ways that Paul himself finds offensive. Yeah. And so he's crawling out Cephas for doing that, claiming his own status as a Judean by birth. Yeah. And also claiming that to descend from the Gentile is to be born a sinner. Yeah. Paul, I just want this little piece from Cicero, as told by Plutarch. So Plutarch is talking about Cicero being smart and clever. For instance, veres is the Roman word for a castrated young pig. So when a freedman named Caecilius, who was suspected of Judaizing, in other words, he's not a Jew, he's acting like a Jew, wanted to push aside the Sicilian accusers and denounce veres himself, Cicero said, because veres is the word for pig, right? What has a Jew to do with a castrated young pig? Da-da-da. It's a joke. It's a mean joke. Get it? It's a mean joke. I mean, like, what could be a worse thing to say about a Jew than call them a young pig, right? That's just like the worst. Yeah, okay. But part of what this proves, not only that, Plutarch is an anti-Jewish jerk, okay, whatever, and that Cicero was too, yeah, not surprising, is also that this calculus guy was made fun of because of Judaizing, because he wasn't a Jew himself. Yeah?
So what would they see as Judaizing?
Well, that's a good question. So I don't know. I mean, we're going to see in a minute, because we're going to get to some second century Romans talking about Christians, because of course we know Christians come to exist. It's not like they don't exist eventually. We just don't have them yet. Yeah. And it seems like Judaizing could be refusing to worship one's ancestral gods, right? So like, for example, you can guess in Aphrodisias, can you guess what goddess they worshipped as their ancestral god? Aphrodite, right? Or in Ephesus, it was Artemis, or in Rome, it's Roma. So most cities had their patron god, and Israel's patron god was Yahweh, right? And worshiped Yahweh in Jerusalem. And the weird thing about Jews from the perspective of non-Jews was, why would they only worship Yahweh? What is the matter with you? Like, can't you just worship Aphrodite when you go to Aphrodisias? Why? Why would you want to mess with Aphrodite? She might mess with our city, if you don't offer her sacrifice, But apparently, even though Jews didn't worship Aphrodite, they still got along with people well enough that they had a soup kitchen that other people gave money to, right? So again, not everybody was, Plutarch and Cicero. Some people really liked Jews, we saw. Good, nice, okay. Now we can read Galatians again. Someone want to read Galatians 6?
Circumcised do not themselves obey the law, but they want to be circumcised so that they may boast about your flesh. May I never boast of anything except the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, which by the world has been crucified to me, and I to the world. For neither circumcision nor uncircumcision is anything, but a new creation is everything. As for those who will follow this rule, peace be among them and mercy and upon the Israel of God.
Okay. Again, I would normally take like at least a month to try to convince you. But what's the problem with these Galatian Judaizers?
They're boastful.
They're boastful, though, okay. Yes, from Paul's perspective, they're boastful. Yeah.
They don't obey the law.
They don't obey the law, right? Which Paul might be interpreting differently than they do. Huh? And they want Gentiles to get circumcised, right? They want Gentiles to get circumcised. And who wants Gentiles to get circumcised? The Judaizers. Who are the Judaizers? They're Gentiles. Yeah, they're Gentiles who probably gotten circumcised. because they follow Jesus the Messiah, and which means that they follow the God of Israel, right? Because you can't follow Christian God because there's no Christian God. So what are you going to follow? You're following the God of Israel. I mean, if you read the Paul's letters and all the citations of the Septuagint, Paul is expecting them to know Jewish scriptures cold, right? Or at least to try to learn them. Yeah? You're following the God of Israel. And so there's some Jesus followers who are Gentile, who think to follow the God of Israel, you ought to get circumcised. From Paul's perspective, that's Judaizing. And you ought not to do it. And he's very angry at them for arguing that you should. And he ends Galatians by, this is right after he said, I read it with my own hand. In other words, he's not dictating it. He's like, please pay attention. The world has been crucified to me, and I to the world, for neither the circumcision nor the uncircumcision is anything when it comes to being made righteous before God, right? But a new creation is everything. Okay, that's the end of Galatians. So Judaizers or Gentiles who want to be Jews by getting circumcised in Paul's letters. I don't know about other places, but let's just stick with that. Okay. So why would Gentile circumcision be a problem? This is the interesting part. Why would Gentile circumcision be a problem? Now, my students usually say, because it hurts. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that for a fact, but I can guess that would really hurt. Okay. Well, let's just...
That story in Genesis with the guys.
Oh yeah, Dinah, the rape of Dinah.
Yeah. Dinah, and they circumcised.
Just come in and kill them. Yes, yeah, exactly. Like, it's a pretty extreme thing to do. Agree. Okay, but what's the evidence if you read Paul's letters carefully? Is that the problem? Is that people are like, oh, we don't want to get circumcised. It's going to be a big owie. The answer is no. They all want to get circumcised. That's the problem. Yeah, the problem is they want to get circumcised. And so before we sort of think, oh, that's impossible, let's remember that from Paul's perspective, if they get circumcised, they're not fulfilling their end-time role. So here's the evidence for that. I'm tired of reading things, so I'm just going to tell you what I think this says, and you've got it in front of you. Okay. The first example is from a Hellenistic Jewish text called Tobit, which is suggesting that at this glorious end of time, the nations of the world, that is the Gentiles, remember the word's the same in Greek, will turn and reverence God in truth. Yeah, they will cast away their idols and which deceitfully have led them into error. They will bless the God of ages in righteousness. In other words, from Tobit's perspective, what's going to happen is the Gentiles are going to worship the God of Israel as Gentiles. They're not going to stop being Gentiles. They're going to be Gentiles who worship Israel. What's the difference about Jews? Jews are Judeans whose ancestral God is Yahweh, who worship the God of Israel. That's what they're supposed to do. That's their God's run in the blood in antiquity. But what's the glorious end time? Well, the Gentiles, that is people who have Aphrodite or Artemis or Roma or, name your God, Zeus, I don't care, Jupiter, whatever, as their God, are going to be like, no, forget that. We're worshiping the God of Israel. And in Tobit, that's the prediction. Yeah. And Tobit's building on a long tradition, particularly in Isaiah, but you can find it elsewhere. It's also in Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and also in Zechariah, that what's going to happen with the Gentiles is that they're going to realize that the Jews were right. Sorry, every time my hair touches the microphone, I'm sorry, I should put my hair up. I'm sorry. Turn to me and be saved, Isaiah says, all the ends of the earth, for I am God and there is no other. By myself I have sworn, from my mouth has gone forth in righteousness as a word that shall not return. To every knee shall bow, every tongue shall swear. Perhaps you know this verse is quite famous. It often gets read at Christmas time. Yeah. So the idea is that Gentiles, as Gentiles, are going to worship the God of Israel. So why shouldn't they Judaize if you're logical Paul? Because if they Judaize, then they're not doing that. They're not worshiping the God of Israel as Gentiles. They're trying to become Jews. And remember how Jews said, oh, if you're descended from Gentiles, you're descended from sinners. Why, but now it's okay because Christ fixed that problem for you. Yeah, you're still a bunch of loser Gentiles. But thanks to Christ, now you're a follower of the God of Israel. Christ, paid the ransom for you because you were loser sinners. Now you're not. Now you've been cleansed. Now you're no longer slave to sin, even though you were because you were Gentiles. But now you're not. But you're not Jews. You have to be Gentiles. Otherwise, this promise doesn't get fulfilled. Yeah.
Also the fact that they don't, right? Like you're trying to be something that you're never going to ever try to make you be.
Yeah,
this thing.
Absolutely. Paul doesn't makes that argument about a lot of different like ontological categories from an ancient perspective, right? That stay as you are. And I'm going to have a little summary of Paul's argument. I'm exactly going to say that. Stay as you are. That seems to be Paul's perspective. Absolutely. We've seen that actually Gentiles could become Jews, right? They could proselytize. Gentiles could become circumcised. In fact, we know a very famous person whose family did that, and that's Herod the Great. Herod the Great's ancestors were Idumean. They were not Jewish, and they were circumcised in the generation. His grandfather was circumcised. So in other words, you could do that, but that's not what Paul wants. And I think this comes from Paula Fredrickson in my own thinking primarily. I'm just giving you a scholarly argument that I know from others. I don't take credit for this. Yeah. The idea would be, well, we need you to be a Gentile or you can't fulfill the end time promise. Okay. So back to the point about why would Gentiles want to be circumcised? Well, why wouldn't you want to go the whole way? Yeah. I mean, think about yourself in the first century if you're being a Christ follower. Who are you worshiping? You're worshiping someone who was crucified. Who's crucified? So do not underestimate how shameful that punishment is. It is a hugely humiliating punishment that the Romans reserved specifically to humiliate people. Everybody knew that. Famously, you will not see a depiction of Jesus on the cross prior to the 4th century, because crucifixion is such a terrible punishment. So who are you following if you become a Gentile follower of the God of Israel through Jesus Christ? You are following a leader who was crucified. That is an extreme thing to do. If you're going to do that, if you're that extreme, do you really think you would like circumcision is that big of a deal? I kind of don't think so. This was an extreme position. And we know it's extreme in part because of what comes in 66 to 73, which is the revolt against the Romans. So the Judeans had a reputation of being restless, of not wanting to obey Roman rule. We've already seen how Claudius expels them from Rome in 41 to 54. Yeah. So to become a follower of the God of Israel is to put yourself at risk in general. Now imagine that you decided to follow the God of Israel because you believe that Jesus was the Messiah of Israel who came to release you from your disgusting descent as a Gentile. I mean, come on. Really, circumcision isn't that bad. Again, this is a scholarly argument, believe it or not, that I'm trying to inhabit right now.
Going back to what you said earlier about appropriating what was meant as an insult or a slander, then the most recognizable symbol of the Christians was the cross.
Yeah.
Which was, as you said, they only did that to make a point.
Exactly. And so what you have, so this is my summary of Paul's view, but I'm going to skip ahead and then I'll come back because it fits to your point, Carl, that's exactly what they knew about Christians when they finally noticed them. Yeah. So this is from circa 170 to 180 CE. So some 60 years after Christians get noticed by non-Christians in terms of the literary record. This satirist named Lucian, who was something like the Trevor Noah of antiquity, writes a satire about a fellow named Peregrinus who keeps converting and changing his mind about what God to follow. And one of the gods that he follows is the God of the Christians. And one of the things that Lucian likes to make fun of them is that they worship a crucified sophist. So somewhere in that long thing, which we're going to read in a minute, is a line from Lucian about how they worship a crucified sophist. So the summary then, what's your name?
Oh, Carmelita.
Carmelita, it's nice to meet you. This was exactly your point. So you credit that from this particularly scholarly read of Paul, right? Gentile Jesus followers, what are they supposed to do? Avoid sexual immorality, control their body and themselves, stay as they are. So if they're enslaved, stay enslaved. If they're a female, stay female. If they're married, stay married, etc. Because why? It's glorious end time. Why would you mess around with your existence when you need to be worrying about the fact that it's a glorious end time, and avoid worship of gods other than that, than the God of Israel. That's the requirements, yeah, from perspective. And the Jewish Jesus followers, the same requirements, except also stay as you are would mean remain circumcised, follow Jewish dietary restrictions, and perform customary rites. This is more controversial, but that's the scholarly argument that's being made right now. We don't have time to unpack it, but if Paul divides the world like this, that's what he thinks Jews should do. Okay. So back to Lucian again. This is Lucian, that satirist, the Tribune of Antiquity. I'm running out of time, and I want to leave us time to discuss this, so I'm going to just summarize some of what he's saying. So he's making fun of this fellow Peregrinus, who becomes, among other religious groups, he learns of the wondrous lore of the Christians, and what does Lucian know about the Christians? Well, they have books. Yeah, this is great evidence for the fact that Christians are bookish. They compose many. What do we know? We got Paul, we got the Gospels, we got other stuff too. Yeah, he knows that. Again, outsider knowledge of what Christians are is really helpful. And who do they worship? A man who was crucified in Palestine. Yeah, so a shameful person. Then he gets thrown into prison, and the Christians think it's terrible, and they bring him food, which I think is actually really nice, but Lucian is making fun of them for doing that. And they show lots of attention to him, and they call him the new Socrates. So Socrates is a famous Greek philosopher who was also forced to commit suicide, so also executed. And in the 2nd century, there's a lot of Christians who use the example of Socrates to say, hey, a person can be killed and still be like the most important person, because no Greek would argue that Socrates isn't awesome by the time Jesus comes along. Then we get this, there's more from Lucian. This keeps going on and on. I encourage you to read The Passing of Peregrinus. It's very interesting evidence for how somebody viewed Christians in the mid to end 2nd century. Then there's discussion about how they think they're immortal. In other words, they believe in the resurrection of the dead. Yeah. Here we go. They transgressed once for all by denying the Greek gods and by worshiping that crucified sophist himself and living under his laws. Therefore, they despise all things indiscriminately and consider them common property, blah, blah, blah. So what makes a Christian distinctive from the perspective of Lucian? If they're a Gentile Christian, they despise worshiping the Greek gods. And that seems to be what ultimately gets Christians and Jews, frankly, but differently, into trouble in the 2nd and 3rd century. Okay, so the answer to the question, how can you recognize a Christian when you see one? The current scholarly answer is you can't. You can't. Or you wonder if they are some kind of Jew or Judaizer. So you might see somebody like, if I all of a sudden told my parents that I'm not going to be going to Christmas Eve service this year because I think their God is a demon, they might notice. Yeah. So imagine this would be what would happen. No, I'm not going to go if I am in Ephesus and it's the feast of Artemis, and there's a big procession that happens in Ephesus every year. That's a big deal. And if I'm a citizen of that city and I'm like a 13-year-old girl, I might get asked to be in the procession. And I say to my mom, no, not going to do that this year. By the way, Artemis is a demon. Yeah, that would go over really well, right? That's the scenario that gets Christ followers into trouble, not because they look different, not because there's a word Christian. It takes time for them to get noticed, but they, like Jews, are refusing to worship a God other than the God of Israel. And that appears to be what's different about them, but they don't look different. No. I mean, this is going to get Christians into trouble when they start getting persecuted too, because then some Christians do offer, this is from the Decian persecution, they do offer some small sacrifice. They might offer some wine or a biscuit or something like that on behalf of a god. And then do they get to come back? How would you even know? See, it's really hard to decide what the borders are. So what made Jesus' followers distinctive and recognizably different, if anything, from an outsider perspective? Not much, especially prior to the revolt of 66 to 73. Okay, Nelson, that's my answer to your question. I have an epilogue here. I'm a scholar of early Christian history, so I spend a lot of time talking about what happens next. So 3 centuries later, the confusion continues. So now we might have the name Christian. We might have, we do definitely have the name Christian. We definitely have the destruction of Jerusalem. Now Jerusalem has been totally destroyed after the Bar Kokhba rebellion in the 2nd century. Jews aren't even allowed in Jerusalem anymore after that rebellion. Nevertheless, guess what? Christians are still observing Jewish festivals in cities in the Greek East. And this is driving the bishops crazy, yeah? Because bishops want there to be a difference between Jews and Christians. We don't know, we don't have evidence to prove like how many Christians are going to Jewish festivals, but we know for a fact that they are. And one that I've written about is the example of the Maccabean martyrs and the transition between Gregory of Nazianzus in 362 and Augustine in the early 5th century, where Gregory of Nazianzus is preaching to his congregation in the Greek East, and he says, oh, who are the Maccabees? The Maccabees would be, I'm not thinking about the brothers Maccabee who defeat who kick Antiochus Epiphanes out of the temple. That's, if you don't know about that story, go take a New Testament course. They're talking about the 7 brothers in a book called Second Maccabees who refused to eat pork and hide the signs of their circumcision, who were executed by the emperor, the Hellenistic Greek emperor. It's a festival called the Feast of Lights, and Gregory says, who are these people that, these Maccabeans who these Jews are worshiping? Well, they're fantastic because they stay true to the faith, and we should worship them too. Yeah? Or venerate them, I should say. And what happens by the time we get to Augustine? Augustine's like, oh, they built this church in Antioch in their honor. Yeah, so we turn the Maccabean martyrs into Christian saints. That's a process that happens in the 4th century. Partly what happens is because Christians are in fact participating in Hanukkah, at least in Nazianzus or Nazi, Gregory. I'm not going to do that one. I'm just going to stop and ask us to think about this question: what's at stake if this hypothesis is true? Again, I'm just offering a particularly scholarly consensus right now for the sake of argument. We're all reading this material together, so there's multiple ways we can interpret it. I just offered you one way of interpreting it that's quite prevalent right now. And this is the name of some of the scholars whose work I'm representing in this very compressed answer to the question that Nelson asked me. How do you recognize a Christian when you see ancient Christian when you see one? And my immediate answer was, well, you can't. And that's why. I've just given you a very quick answer why. And so here's some names of people who you might want to read if you want to explore that question further. Thoughts? Yeah.
Jenny, this is, I mentioned, this is from the letter to Diognetus, a Christian writing around 160 or so. I've just got to read a few lines.
Please do, Christian. Please do.
For the distinction between Christians and other men is neither in country, nor language, nor customs. For they do not dwell in cities in some strange place of their own, nor do they use any strange variety of dialect, nor practice an extraordinary kind of life. The teaching of theirs has not been discovered by the intellect or the thought of busy men, nor are they advocates of any human doctrine as some men are. Yet while living in Greek and barbarian cities, according as each obtained his lot, and following the local customs, both in clothing and food and in the rest of life, they show forth the wonderful and confessedly strange character of the constitution of their own citizenship. I'll just read the last line here. They passed, let's see, they offer free hospitality, but guard their purity. Their lot is cast in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. They pass their time upon earth, but have their citizenship in heaven.
So there we have the epistle to the Diagnete is exactly making this point that you can't tell a Christian when you see one. Nevertheless, they still want to say that you can, right? Or this letter does, because we want to be able to say Christians are recognizable because they're so ethically proper, right? And they behave really well in the city, and they, they're very respectful, and they control themselves and their bodies, right? That is a Christian claim, and I hope that's true, and I hope that's still true today, and I hope Christians continue to be models in that way. But as we know, sometimes Christians are not models in that way, at least in my contemporary experience, at the same time that others who aren't Christian are. And presumably that was true in antiquity as well. Yeah. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean that we don't want to go to church and be exhorted to live up to the call that Christians claim. Yeah.
One more question.
Yeah.
I grew up seeing Solomon's Head of Christ was.
Oh yeah, me too.
That's the picture of Jesus.
Yeah.
I can't get out of my mind.
Are you?
Yeah. I was watching Amy Jo Levine,
yeah.
AJ video.
Yeah.
And she's showing Jesus with like phylactery, with the the earlocks, all of that, which does make him look different.
Yes.
From Gentiles.
Right. Well, so right. So the question is, well, there's a complicated question. Oops, I went the wrong way. I want to go this way. Around the forelocks. The phylacteries were worn by Jews in the first century. That's certainly possible. I mean, it depends again on who you read. Like this, I didn't put it up there, but there's another scholar by the name of Ron Bustan who makes a very similar claim about Jews. Not in Judea, not when you're worshiping, not when you're engaged in the festivals and so on. Then you put on your proper clothes, right? Then you do try to look Jewish if you're a Jew there. But if you're living in Ephesus, you're living in Ephesus, you're living in Rome, wherever, you wouldn't necessarily be able to recognize a Jew walking on the street. Yeah. In fact, one thing that happens after the destruction of the temple and the first Jewish revolt is something called the Jewish tax. That the emperor Vespasian and then all of the Flavian emperors enforced something called the Jewish tax, where instead of sending funds to the temple, which was something that Jews living in outside of Jerusalem did, as a way of showing their attachment to the cult in Israel, instead of doing that, a mean thing that the Romans did was said, now instead of paying the temple, you're going to pay us. And in fact, the Colosseum in Rome was built by the spoils of the war. In Judea. So this temple tax, how are you going to enforce people having to pay, and not the temple tax, the fiscus Judaeus, the Jewish tax, how are you going to enforce that if you can't tell them the Jew is? Well, there's a terrible story in Suetonius we read earlier about Domitian going around and asking city councilors to pull up the clothes of Jewish men to see whether they're circumcised or not, or of men they suspected of being Jewish, as a way of saying, if you're circumcised, why aren't you paying the Jewish tax? So why do that if you can recognize a Jew when you see one? Nevertheless, to go back to Amy Jo Levine's point, I think there's no reason to imagine that Jesus wouldn't have forelocks and wear phylacteries and prayer shawls. Why wouldn't he do that when you've got a standing temple, when you've got Jesus and his followers going to Jerusalem all the time? He certainly didn't look like Verna Solomon's Jesus, despite the fact that I grew up with that picture in my mind, I think. I mean, what's at stake here is something around difference even now, right? What it means to be Christian even now, which is why I usually take at least a month to get through this kind of material, because it's sometimes shocking for some of my students. It's not shocking for me anymore because I'm used to it. I've been a professor for 20 years. I know these folks. I've been doing this reading, and I don't think it's actually a challenge to Christianity in any way, shape, or form. But some people experience it that way because it's strange. But why shouldn't we be, or Christians, I'm going to put myself in a we of Christians for the moment, since I'm doing a Sunday school class and not teaching my undergrads. Why shouldn't we be thrilled that Jesus was fully Jewish in every possible way? And why shouldn't we be grateful like if we're going to follow Paul's advice, that we're now part of the people of Israel. That's something to be grateful for, not glad, we Gentile Christians. But we shouldn't imagine that, that there's something wrong with Jews. I mean, that's part of what happens is that as Christianity goes on, because of the anti-Jewish rhetoric that starts in the 2nd century, and there start to be Christians who aren't Jews and who don't see themselves as Jewish appendages or addendums, who then turn their hatred against Jews. And we see the results of that. That is something to be rejected. Yeah, sorry. I had to watch.
No, that's right. Wonderful presentation again, as always. I hope you join us again very soon. Thank you, Jennifer Knust, for being with us today.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for being in.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kristen.
Next week is the Reverend Dr. Brian Stratton, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at UNC Pembroke, will model for us divine diplomacy, models for inter-religious dialogue.
I tell who he is the husband of.
He is the husband of the Reverend Dr. Carol Gregg. Or what do they say? More degrees than a thermometer in that family. Have a great week. See you next week.
Thank you.